Nolan Carter had spent his entire life building a fortress of success around himself. To the world, he was the epitome of ambition, sharp, unrelenting, and always a step ahead. Known in elite circles as a man who could turn any venture into gold, Nolan thrived in the cutthroat world of corporate empires. Yet, beneath his tailored suits and private jets lay a man whose existence revolved around control and a fear of vulnerability he couldn't afford to acknowledge. His world was a curated display of opulence, grand estates, lavish galas, and the admiration of those who sought to bask in his glow. Nolan had no time for sentiment or connection. Relationships were mere transactions in his eyes, temporary distractions that paled against the thrill of his next conquest. Every choice and every move he made was calculated, serving the singular goal of maintaining his dominance in a world ruled by wealth. But beneath the power and prestige lay a hollowness he refused to confront. Success was his armor, shielding him from the cracks he dared not examine. Nolan Carter was invincible. To that Erohima, a man untouched by the trivialities of emotion or failure. Yet, deep inside, he knew that his empire, though mighty, had been built on foundations that were not as unshakable as he wanted the world to believe. And it was at the peak of this carefully constructed kingdom, during one of his grand soirees, Nolan's perfectly controlled life would begin to unravel, ushered in by a challenge he could never have foreseen and one he would not dare to refuse. The night of Nolan's infamous gala unfolded like a scene from a cinematic masterpiece. His sprawling estate, illuminated by crystal chandeliers and golden uplighting, was a haven for the city's most influential figures. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of a live orchestra filled the air as guests mingled, their expensive attire glittering like stars. This was just another performance for Nolan, another opportunity to reinforce his place atop the social and financial hierarchy. But that evening held a twist Nolan couldn't have predicted. One stood out like a storm on the horizon. Mason Walker among the sea of familiar faces. Once a college rival, Mason had always been a thorn in Nolan's side. While Nolan thrived on careful planning, Mason operated with audacious charm, often succeeding through wit and instinct. The two had spent their younger years locked in a constant battle of one-upmanship, and it seemed that, even now, Mason had come prepared to reignite the fire. "Still throwing the same parties, I see," Mason remarked, his voice carrying an air of mockery as he approached Nolan. "You haven't changed, have you? Everything controlled, everything perfect." Nolan smirked, raising a glass of champagne. "And yet you're here, Mason. As predictable as ever." Their exchange drew the attention of nearby guests, the subtle tension between them sparking curiosity. Mason leaned closer, his voice dropping just enough to suggest mischief. "Tell me, Nolan, do you ever take risks? Real risks? Or does your comfort zone have a velvet rope, too?" Nolan's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. "What are you getting at?" Mason's grin widened, and with a dramatic pause, he raised his glass. "A bet. A challenge. Something that'll test whether you're as invincible as you think you are." The room grew quieter as Mason elaborated, his voice steady but laced with provocation. "You've mastered business, Nolan. Wealth, power. It's all yours. But I don't think you'd last 6 months in a marriage with a woman who doesn't fit your perfect mold. Someone who doesn't care about your money, reputation, or control. What do you say? 6 months, no divorces, no running." Nolan laughed, his amusement masking the flicker of unease Mason's words had sparked. "And what do I gain from this little experiment?" Mason's eyes gleamed. "A stake in my company. The one you've been circling for years." The mention of Mason's company, the one acquisition Nolan had yet to conquer, was like a trigger. It was more than a prize. It challenged Nolan's pride. To back down would be to admit defeat, something he hadn't done in decades. "Deal," Nolan replied coolly, extending his hand. His voice was calm, but inside, his mind raced. Whatever Mason had planned, Nolan was determined to prove him wrong. The room erupted in murmurs and laughter as glasses were raised. What had begun as a casual exchange had turned into a spectacle, a game that promised to test the limits of Nolan Carter's control. The days following the gala were a blur of arrangements. True to his word, Mason wasted no time introducing Nolan to his chosen challenge. Nolan expected someone unimpressive, perhaps even unpleasant, a woman Mason had plucked out of obscurity to complicate his life. But nothing could have prepared him for Elena Rivers. The meeting occurred in a quiet, upscale restaurant, which Mason chose. Nolan arrived first, seated in a private booth with his usual air of authority. He glanced at his watch impatiently, wondering how long Mason intended to keep him waiting. Then, the door opened, and in walked Elena. She was nothing like Nolan had expected. Dressed simply yet elegantly, with an air of quiet confidence, Elena carried herself as though she belonged anywhere she chose to be. Her presence was magnetic, not because of ostentatious beauty, but because of the unshakable strength in her demeanor. As Mason introduced them, Elena offered Nolan a firm handshake, her gaze steady and piercing. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice calm and assured. "I've heard a lot about you." Nolan, momentarily caught off guard, recovered quickly. "Likewise." Clearly enjoying the tension, Mason excused himself under the pretense of a phone call, leaving the two alone. Nolan started with his usual charm, offering polite small talk, but Elena wasn't interested. "Let's not waste time," she said bluntly, leaning back in her chair. "I know about the bet." Her words cut through Nolan's facade, though he masked his surprise. "And yet, here you are," he replied smoothly. "Why?" Elena's expression didn't waver. "Because I have my reasons. Let's just say I'm curious about how far someone like you is willing to go to win." Her directness was disarming. Nolan was used to people who were either intimidated by him or eager to please. Elena was neither, which intrigued him in a way he didn't expect. But behind her confidence, there was something he couldn't quite place, a guardedness, as though she was holding onto secrets she had no intention of sharing. Their conversation ended with no pleasantries. As Elena left, she turned back briefly. "If you expect me to be impressed by your money or power, don't bother. That's not what I value." Nolan watched her leave, unsettled. For the first time in years, he felt like he was stepping into unfamiliar territory, a game where his usual strategies might not work. And though he hated to admit it, the prospect both frustrated and intrigued him. Days after their first meeting, Nolan replayed his conversation with Elena. Her confidence and unwillingness to conform to his expectations lingered in his thoughts, disrupting his usual focus. It wasn't often that someone left him questioning his approach, and the idea that she might pose a real challenge irritated and intrigued him. Mason wasted no time arranging the wedding. Still fueled by pride and the determination to win, Nolan accepted the arrangement with the same businesslike efficiency he applied to mergers and acquisitions. The ceremony was small and devoid of sentiment, held in a courthouse with only a few witnesses. Nolan wore his usual tailored suit, his expression betraying none of the unease he felt. Elena wore a simple but elegant dress, and Elin maintained her composure, treating the event as a transaction rather than a celebration. As they exchanged vows, Nolan couldn't help but notice the absence of warmth in Elena's voice. She played her role flawlessly, yet there was no effort to disguise her disinterest. This wasn't a union but a challenge, a test of wills that had only begun. After the ceremony, Nolan brought Elena to his penthouse, a gleaming symbol of his success. The space was designed to impress with its panoramic city views and exquisite decor. He had expected some reaction, admiration, perhaps even awe, but Elena barely glanced at her surroundings. "This is where you live?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Yes," Nolan replied, his voice tinged with pride. "I thought you'd appreciate the view." Elena turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "It's beautiful but doesn't tell me anything about you. All I see is someone trying to impress the world." Her words stung, though Nolan wouldn't admit it. Used to controlling every aspect of his life, he found Elena's indifference unsettling. She wasn't like anyone he'd encountered before, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the tactics that had always worked for him wouldn't work here. As the days passed, their interactions were polite but distant. Nolan, determined to assert control, showered Elena with lavish gifts, jewelry, designer clothes, and exclusive experiences. Each gesture was met with the same calm indifference. One evening, after presenting her with an extravagant necklace, Nolan finally voiced his frustration. "Is there anything I can do to make you happy?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Elena placed the unopened box back on the table, her gaze steady. "Happiness isn't something you can buy, Nolan. If you want this to work, you must try harder than that." It was a challenge Nolan hadn't expected, and it left him feeling both frustrated and intrigued. He wasn't in control for the first time in years, and it was a feeling he couldn't ignore. Determined to gain the upper hand, Nolan shifted his strategy. Instead of relying on wealth and extravagance, he began orchestrating intimate dinners and romantic getaways, hoping to create an emotional connection. But even these efforts seemed to falter. One weekend, he planned a surprise trip to a secluded mountain resort. He envisioned it as the perfect opportunity to break through Elena's defenses and show her a more personal side of himself. When he revealed the plan, however, Elena's response was firm. "This isn't part of our agreement," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you want to enjoy the resort, go ahead. But don't think you can manipulate me into spending time with you." Her refusal was a blow to Nolan's ego, but it also forced him to confront a more profound truth. His usual methods weren't just ineffective, they were pushing her further away. This realization was humbling and infuriating for someone who had built his life on strategy and control. In his frustration, Nolan confronted Elena one evening in the penthouse. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and it finally erupted into words. "Why are you making this so difficult?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm trying to make this work, and all you do is push me away." Elena, seated calmly on the couch, met his gaze without flinching. "Because you're not trying to make this work, Nolan. You're trying to control me. That's the difference." Her words struck a nerve, forcing Nolan to take a step back. He saw the cracks in his approach for the first time. The arrogance, the assumption that he could bend anyone to his will. It was a sobering moment that left him questioning more than just the bet. In the weeks that followed, Nolan's frustration gave way to introspection. He started paying closer attention to Elena, observing what mattered to her. She wasn't impressed by grand gestures or material wealth. She valued authenticity and respect. Slowly, Nolan began to understand that winning this challenge would require more than persistence. It would require change. It was a quiet evening in the penthouse, the city's distant hum providing a subtle backdrop as Nolan and Elena sat in their usual tense silence. Nolan had been reviewing some business reports, but his focus had been fractured. He couldn't shake the sense that he was on the edge of something significant, a truth he hadn't yet uncovered. Elena's guarded demeanor was impenetrable, but tonight, she seemed weighed down by something more profound. Finally, she broke the silence. "You asked me once why I agreed to this," Elena began, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion Nolan couldn't immediately place. She was seated across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. Nolan set his reports aside, meeting her gaze. "I did," he said carefully. "And you never really answered." Elena exhaled as if bracing herself. "I agreed because I wanted you to face the consequences of your actions. To understand what your so-called success has cost others." Her words struck him like a blow. "What are you talking about?" he asked, genuinely confused. "My father," Elena said, her voice thick with restrained emotion. "He was a small business owner, a proud man who built something meaningful, something he hoped to pass down to me one day. But then your company decided to expand, and his business became collateral damage. You undercut his suppliers, poached his clients, and left him with nothing." Nolan felt a chill run down his spine. He vaguely remembered the acquisition she referred to, another strategic move bolstering his empire. To him, it had been a victory. To her, it had been devastation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't know." Elena's eyes burned with a mixture of pain and resolve. "Of course you didn't. To you, it was just another line on a balance sheet. But to us, it was everything. My father fell into a depression he couldn't escape. He took his own life because of what you did." The room closes in around Nolan. He felt the weight of her words, the unflinching truth of her pain. But she wasn't finished. And it didn't end there. Elena continued, her voice trembling. I was pregnant at the time, just a few weeks along. Despite everything falling apart, my father was excited to be a grandfather. But the stress, the grief, it was too much. I lost the baby. Nolan was stunned into silence. He had always known his business tactics were ruthless, but he had never considered the personal cost to those on the other side of his decisions. He had never imagined that his actions could lead to a loss so profound. I didn't tell you this to make you feel guilty, Elena said, her tone softer now. I told you because you need to understand. People aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, Nolan. They have lives, families, and futures. And when you destroy those things, it leaves scars that don't heal. For the first time in his life, Nolan felt utterly powerless. Words felt inadequate, but he managed to say the only thing that came to mind. I'm so sorry, Elena. I didn't know. I never meant for. It doesn't matter what you meant, Elena interrupted. What matters is what you did, and what you choose to do now. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Nolan realized that this wasn't just about the bet anymore. It was about redemption, facing the consequences of a life without accountability. The following days were marked by a profound shift in Nolan's demeanor. The weight of Elena's revelation was destabilizing for a man who had spent his life in control. He replayed her words, questioning decisions he had once regarded as triumphs. For the first time, he saw his empire not as a monument to his success, but as a collection of decisions that had caused immeasurable harm. Nolan began taking steps toward redemption, though he quickly realized it wouldn't be an easy path. His first instinct was to offer financial compensation to Elena's family and others affected by his ruthless practices. But when he suggested this to Elena, her response was sharp and unwavering. You think money will fix this? She asked, her voice laced with disappointment. This isn't about writing checks, Nolan. It's about acknowledging the damage you've done and finding a way to make it right. Her words forced him to reconsider. If he was going to make amends, it couldn't be through superficial gestures. It had to be accurate, meaningful, and rooted in genuine accountability. Nolan began reaching out to the families of those whose businesses he had destroyed. The process was humbling and often humiliating. Many refused to speak with him, their anger still raw. Others confronted him with stories of loss and hardship that left him reeling. But he persisted, determined to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. Meanwhile, Elena watched from a distance. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she couldn't help noticing the sincerity in his efforts. He was no longer the man who had once flaunted his wealth and power without a second thought. He was becoming willing to confront his flaws and take responsibility for his mistakes. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings with affected families, Nolan returned to the penthouse, exhausted but resolute. Elena was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal. She glanced at him as he entered, her expression neutral but not unkind. How was it? She asked, her tone casual. Hard, Nolan admitted, loosening his tie. But necessary. Elena nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. Good, she said simply before returning to her cooking. It wasn't an olive branch, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that he was trying. And for Nolan, it was enough to keep going. Nolan's journey toward redemption was grueling, but with every step, he found himself confronting aspects of his life he had long ignored. His once flawless perception of control now seemed like a shallow illusion. Instead of seeking comfort in his usual distractions, he began listening to the stories of those he had harmed, the unspoken pain in Elena's voice, and even the silence that lingered in their shared space. For Elena, observing Nolan's transformation was a paradox. She couldn't deny the visible changes in him, the humility in his posture, the sincerity in his efforts, but her scars ran deep, and trust wasn't something she could rebuild overnight. Still, there were moments when her guard slipped, moments when she allowed herself to see glimpses of the man he was trying to become. One evening, as Nolan returned from another long day of meeting with families, he found Elena seated at the dining table, sketching absent-mindedly in a notebook. She didn't look up as he entered, but something about her quiet presence felt different. He hesitated before speaking. I know this won't mean much, he began, his voice careful, "but I'm trying to understand what I can do to make things right. Not just for them, for you." Elena glanced up, her expression unreadable. "You can't undo the past, Nolan," she said, her tone measured. "But maybe you can stop living like it never mattered." Her words stayed with him. They weren't an absolution, but they carried a sliver of possibility. That night, Nolan began drafting a new plan, not for his business empire, but for a charity to support small business owners, offering resources and opportunities to those corporations like his had displaced. When he showed the draft to Elena days later, she studied it in silence. He braced himself for rejection, but when she finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Approval, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement. "This could help people," she said simply, handing the papers back to him. Her words were like a lifeline, and Nolan clung to them as he threw himself into the project. With each passing day, he found himself caring less about appearances and more about the work itself. He wasn't chasing power for the first time in years. He was chasing purpose. As Nolan's efforts continued, the dynamic between him and Elena shifted subtly. Their conversations grew less combative, and moments of connection emerged, fragile but undeniable. One evening, Elena invited Nolan to join her in the kitchen, where he rarely ventured. She was preparing dinner, something simple, but the act felt intimate. Determined not to squander the opportunity, Nolan rolled up his sleeves and offered to help. "You ever chop vegetables before?" Elena asked, a teasing glint in her eyes as she handed him a knife. "Not unless you count signing contracts," Nolan replied with a smirk, eliciting the faintest smile from her. As they worked side by side, the tension between them softened. Elena told him stories about her childhood, her father's love for cooking, and how their family dinners had once been filled with laughter and warmth. Nolan listened intently, realizing how foreign such experiences were to him. After dinner, they lingered at the table, sipping tea and discussing things that had nothing to do with their past grievances. Elena mentioned her love for painting, something she hadn't touched since her father's death. Nolan didn't push her to revisit it, but his genuine interest in her passions didn't go unnoticed. Over time, these moments became more frequent. Walks in the park, shared meals, and quiet evenings in the penthouse slowly replaced the cold distance that had once defined their relationship. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a gradual, organic rebuilding of trust. One day, while walking through a nearby art gallery, Elena stopped in front of a blank canvas display meant for community submissions. Nolan watched as her fingers hovered over the edge of the canvas, her expression thoughtful. "You should try," he said gently. Elena hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Maybe," she replied, her voice soft. Later that week, Nolan surprised her with a set of art supplies. He didn't present them with fanfare, simply leaving them on the table where she would find them. When she saw the gesture, she didn't say anything, but the faint smile on her lips spoke volumes. As Elena began painting again, her walls began to lower. She started sharing more of herself, her pain, dreams, hopes, and fears. Nolan, in turn, opened up about his vulnerabilities, admitting how his relentless drive for success had often been a mask for deeper insecurities. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, lingering doubts, and the shadow of their shared past. But they were learning to navigate these challenges together, choosing to confront their fears instead of retreating into old patterns. Months into their evolving dynamic, a subtle rhythm had formed between Nolan and Elena. Their conversations carried a new depth, the unspoken tension between them giving way to quiet moments of understanding. Yet, despite the progress, the shadow of the past still lingered. Its weight felt most acutely during their silences. The turning point came unexpectedly. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elena received a call from an old friend who managed a local art gallery. Unaware of the turmoil in Elena's life, the friend invited her to participate in an upcoming exhibition showcasing independent artists. The invitation stirred a mix of emotions: fear, nostalgia, and a faint spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Elena hesitated to tell Nolan initially, unsure if she was ready to revisit that part of herself. But when she finally mentioned it over dinner, his reaction surprised her. You should do it, Nolan said without hesitation, setting his fork down. His gaze was steady, sincere. Your work deserves to be seen. Elena studied him, searching for any trace of insincerity, but found none. His encouragement, though unexpected, planted a seed of possibility. The next day, she visited the gallery, walking through its familiar halls as memories of her artistic ambitions resurfaced. When she returned home, she found Nolan in the living room, reviewing plans for his charity fund. I think I'll try it, she said softly, her voice carrying both resolve and vulnerability. Nolan looked up, a rare smile spreading across his face. I'm glad, he replied. Let me know how I can help. Elena threw herself into her work, her makeshift studio becoming a sanctuary where she could lose herself in color and form. Nolan respected her space, offering quiet support when needed and stepping back when she didn't. He watched her transformation with a mix of admiration and awe, recognizing that this was more than a return to painting. It was a reclaiming of herself. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Elena stood nervously in the gallery, her paintings displayed on pristine white walls. Guests admired her work, offering compliments that felt both validating and overwhelming. Nolan stayed in the background, content to observe her moment of triumph from a distance. When their eyes met across the room, Elena's guarded smile softened, a silent acknowledgement of his role in helping her get here. As the evening drew to a close, Elena approached Nolan, her expression a mixture of gratitude and relief. Thank you, she said simply. You don't need to thank me, Nolan replied. This was all you. Elena felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years, not just for her art, but for the possibility of moving forward. The weeks following the exhibition brought a newfound ease to their relationship. Elena's passion for art reignited, and Nolan continued his work with the charity fund, his focus shifting from damage control to genuine purpose. Taunts marked by tension, their interactions carried an undercurrent of mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city, Nolan broke the comfortable silence. The glow of the city lights reflected in his eyes as he turned to Elena, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I've been thinking about us, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. And about everything that's happened. Elena set her mug of tea down, her gaze attentive but cautious. Go on. Nolan exhaled deeply, gathering his thoughts. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about the bet. It became about you. About wanting to be someone worthy of your trust, your respect, maybe even your love. Elena's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so open. Nolan, I'm not asking for anything, he interrupted gently, sensing her hesitation. I just needed to tell you how I feel. I know I can't erase the past, but I want you to know I'm committed to building something real with you. If you'll let me. Elena looked at him, her emotions warring within her. She couldn't deny that Nolan had changed, that his efforts had gone beyond surface-level redemption. But the scars of the past still lingered, and forgiveness wasn't something she could give lightly. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, her voice soft but firm. There's still so much I haven't worked through. I understand, Nolan said quietly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Their conversation marked a shift in their relationship. While Elena wasn't ready to fully open her heart, she began to see Nolan as more than the man who had once caused her pain. His sincerity, humility, and determination to make amends were undeniable. The following days were filled with small but meaningful moments. They shared breakfast conversations that felt natural, walked through the park without the weight of old grievances, and even collaborated on a fundraiser for Nolan's charity. These moments, though simple, were the foundation of something new, something fragile but real. The turning point came one evening when Elena, after hours spent painting, approached Nolan in the kitchen. He was chopping vegetables, a habit he had picked up in their shared meals, and glanced up as she entered. You're getting better at that, she teased, gesturing to his precise knife work. I've had a good teacher, Nolan replied with a faint smile. Elena hesitated, then spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, about building something real. Nolan set the knife down, his full attention on her. And I think I'm willing to try, she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. But it has to be on equal terms. No more control, no more manipulation. Just us. Relief washed over Nolan, but he didn't push. I can do that, he said simply. Thank you for giving me a chance. Their tentative agreement marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the past but by the potential of a future built on mutual trust and respect. The weeks following Elena's decision to try building a relationship with Nolan were a delicate dance of progress and vulnerability. Both understood that trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick. Their relationship wasn't a romantic fantasy, but a patient journey of two people trying to find common ground amidst a tangled past. Nolan threw himself into the charity work, which had become a personal mission rather than a public relations move. The charity now included mentorship programs for small business owners, legal aid for entrepreneurs fighting unfair practices, and grants for those looking to rebuild. Nolan insisted on meeting these business owners personally, listening to their stories, and finding ways to offer meaningful support. Watching from the sidelines, Elena couldn't deny her growing respect for his efforts. His transformation was evident not only in the grand gestures of charity, but in how he approached everyday life. He no longer dictated terms, but truly listened to the people around him. One morning, as they shared coffee in the kitchen, Nolan hesitated before speaking. There's something I'd like to show you, he said, his tone uncharacteristically nervous. Elena raised an eyebrow. What is it? Nolan led her to a room she had never paid much attention to. When he opened the door, Elena was stunned. Inside was a small gallery-like space, its walls lined with her paintings. Some were from the exhibition, while others were older pieces she had thought were lost. I contacted a few of your friends, Nolan explained, his voice soft. They helped me track down some of your earlier work. Maybe it was time for you to see what you've accomplished. Elena's breath caught as she walked through the room, memories flooding back with each painting. This wasn't just a gesture of support. It was a recognition of who she was beyond the pain, beyond the past. I don't know what to say, she admitted, turning to face him. You don't have to say anything, Nolan replied. I just wanted you to know how much your work matters, to me and others. It was a moment of connection neither of them could deny, a step forward in a journey that still had miles to go. Months later, their lives had taken on a rhythm that felt almost natural. Elena's art career flourished, with her paintings gaining recognition in galleries beyond their city. Nolan's charity had grown into a force of change, earning respect even from his harshest critics. Together, they built a relationship and a legacy of redemption and hope. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, an act that had become a cherished ritual, Elena paused, her expression thoughtful. There's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. Nolan set down the knife he was using and turned to her, concern flashing in his eyes. What is it? Elena took a deep breath, placing a hand on her abdomen. I'm pregnant. For a moment, the world seemed to be still. Nolan's face shifted from shock to a mixture of joy and concern. Are you okay with this? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Elena nodded, a small smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. I am, and I wanted you to know that I believe we can do this. Together, Nolan reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. Elena, I'll be with you every step of the way. I promise. The following months were a whirlwind of preparation, anticipation, and a deepening bond between them. They attended doctor's appointments together, decorated a nursery in soft hues, and discussed their hopes and fears for the future. For Nolan, the pregnancy represented not just the promise of a child, but the opportunity to build a family grounded in love, trust, and mutual respect, something he had never truly experienced before. When the day came, Nolan was by Elena's side as she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Holding their son for the first time, Nolan felt profound gratitude and purpose. He looked at Elena, her exhaustion giving way to a radiant smile, and knew their journey, though fraught with challenges, had led them to this moment. Indermi became a sanctuary of warmth and laughter. In thin theologian Solon Solani's work with fatherhood, often marveling at how much his priorities had shifted. Elena, too, found a new sense of fulfillment, both as a mother and as an artist whose work now reflected themes of renewal and hope. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony, their son sleeping soundly in Elena's arms, Nolan turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't know where I'd be without you," he said. "You've made me better in ways I never thought possible." Elena smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We've both grown, Nolan, and we did it together." As the city lights twinkled around them, they knew their journey wasn't over. Life would always bring challenges, but they had found strength in each other, a love forged through pain, redemption, and the determination to build something beautiful. And for the first time, they faced the future not as individuals bound by a reckless bet, but as partners, ready to embrace whatever came next. Together,